Luc?
So while everybody's ramping up, I'm seeing more and more people attending. Welcome to you, everybody, to this third series in the Seaside Development 101 series. And today we will have David Singleton presenting. Welcome, David. It will be on field basics, as you see. Last time, 3 weeks ago, it was my turn to start with table basics. And today, yes, of course, with tables, you will have to work with fields, and that's the topic of today. A couple of household rules for today. And David, if you could move to the next slide, please. You know that this will be recorded, and you can find them on Mark's YouTube channel. It will be often, let's say, within the hour of ending this webinar that we'll get it available. And of course, any new webinars we will plan are to be found on our website. After this slide, you can see that we will continue with this series. If you have questions, please use the GoToWebinar question window. I'm the moderator for today, and I will be looking at the questions you have, and I'll be stepping in if it makes sense to do so and post them to David to answer. And might also be, meanwhile, that I'll be answering some of your questions already in the questions pane. So keep an eye on it if you have questions, but feel free to post your questions. In that sense, this webinar is for you. Of course, a big thanks to once again, to Liberty Grove for servicing us, for hosting us on this every time again. This is a great experience. So especially to you, Joe Mattis, for setting up this meeting and making the recording work. David, just move to the next slide. Then we see what is left of the planned sessions for this series. We have planned up until number 7. Next time, in 4 weeks' time, Rob Sanchez will elaborate on pages and what about pages. And of course, there are some things left. And as you can see on May 22, David will pick up again on field advanced. Might touch up on some things today, but let's say the deeper part we will be picking up on that session. The report session on June 19, we don't have somebody yet assigned to do the presentation, but we'll find something. And if you know a colleague, or you might be one of the ones just listening but experienced enough with reports to tell some things on it, be free to contact us. We will end before summer with the queries session of Dave Mechanik. I always wonder how you pronounce it. I'm not an English mother language speaking guy, so you can correct me on that. For today, we have Dave Singleton, and Dave has been around in the NAV world for a long time already. In that sense, Dave is truly senior to me with, let's say, about 7-8 years. And for over 12 years, Dave has been MVP, rewarded for the things he's done in the community. A lot, especially in the early years of Mibuso getting up as a platform and Dynamics user, and you can still find David around there helping a lot of people out in answering their questions. And in between, let's say, in between 1992 and today, Dave has not just been, let's say, helping people out in the community, but also professionally helping a lot of people out, being on one hand a general NAV specialist, but specifically on performance optimizations and I could say maybe troubleshooting in general, helping as an independent consultant, getting projects back up and running, or in the next stage where it was halted somehow. And today, David will share his knowledge, and specifically dedicated on fields and everything related to that. So, David, the floor is yours for the next, let's say, 50 minutes. At the end, we'll hope to have enough time to have some questions, Q&A, some questions and answers. But as I said, feel free to feed your questions into the questions pane. David, it's yours.
Thank you, Luc. Okay, so basically what we're covering today are fields. Last session was Luc covering tables, and tables really what this is all about, and fields are what make tables. So what I'm going to start with is a question that I'm not going to answer because it's far too complex for this. Basically, what is an ERP system? It's a very complex thing, and we're not going to go into it, but what we are going to do is to look at what are the components that we're looking at here in this course. And that fundamentally is a database. So basically, we have data, we use some sort of a process, we put it into a database, and we pull it out again. And these are the aspects of Dave Studebaker's book that we're going to be covering. It's the how do you get the data from wherever you get it from onto a report? Ultimately, that's what we're all trying to do here. And this is where it goes. So as I said, the most important part of everything's very important, of course, but the tables are what hold everything together. And tables are basically contain rows and columns, and the columns are made up by fields. So these orange topics are what we're going to cover. Now, this part of the book covers different areas, and it was a bit difficult to decide where to break it up. So as Luc hinted towards at the beginning, we're going to do Chapter 3 here today is going to be the basics of fields and data types, and number 5 will be the more complex and detailed data. So hopefully everybody has at least seen the previous 2 videos. If you weren't there live, at least watch them on a rerun on YouTube. They will be very useful if you have. Before I get started, I just want to throw this in here. When you are looking at Navision, you will come across table data and tables. You'll only actually end up seeing this in security. That's the only place that most people ever come across this. It's not really seen anywhere else. But when we go into our permissions and we look at our Navision permissions, we can see different types, and we can see that if we add a new permission, we have the normal objects, we have table data and tables. What's important to understand is that the table data itself is all stored in SQL tables. They are rows and columns stored in SQL as classic SQL data that any SQL developer, any .NET developer can access and use. When in Navision we see this table, this is all metadata. Tables, reports, code units, these don't actually, they exist in SQL, but not in any format that's usable. That is the structure. So when it says the table, this is the structure of the table. It tells you how Navision sees all this information. It isn't the actual data itself. So we're only interested in table data in this particular session, in terms of what SQL sees. But just so that everyone understands the difference in those two if you come across it. Okay, a bit of a diversion, but I just didn't want that question popping up. Let's start. So what is a field? It's very simple. A field is it's an element of a table. The table is made up of rows, and each row has a number of identical columns. The core in Navision to start is it needs an identifier. You need to identify what is that column, what the type is, and there needs to be a primary key or an index attached to it. Other properties attached, there'll be properties, triggers, and keys, and we're going to get to those. So let's have a look at some rows. This is, you've all seen this because everybody's done the exercises in Dave Studebaker's book, so you all know this is the radio show table structure. This is just copied from Navision back into Excel. What's important here, we have the columns. So these columns here all store data in rows this way. Very importantly, this first column in this particular case is our primary index. We also have indexes on other columns, but those are the ones that matter. So how does that get in Navision? Well, fairly simple. We go into Navision and we open the object designer, we create new, and we create a table. Since this has already been done in the earlier course, I'm not going to line by line type all this in. I hope everybody's up to speed on that, but we're going to explain what happens here and how it all works. So each field, the information, as I said, the critical information is to have a field number. So I have my field number. I have a description of that field, and I have a type. That's the critical information to have it. And Navision will add an index. So what does that do? When I have all that information together and I run it, hopefully come here, I then get, through the RTC, has created me a view of my data. Okay, and there are all of my columns, which I've manually typed and put into here in different senses. Now, what did that actually do when I created that? When I went into here, and I go in here, and I go new, and I do field, code, script, okay, text, code, 1, 2. What that has gone and done, if we're lucky, is over here in my database and in my tables, as I refresh them, it's created this table. So there's a direct one-to-one link between every field here and SQL. I can, in here, I can go in, I can enter data, I can go back to Navision, I can run it, and my data is in here, and the two are linked. So these fields are all one-to-one in SQL. And there's my tags. Right, simple, straightforward. Okay, so let's have a look at what's going on here. Yep, there we go. Right, so I can have a much more complex, I've done that, sorry, and I just realized I haven't kept up with here, have I? So basically, when we look at everything, every column that we've created here in Navision relates to a direct field here in SQL. The types in most cases match across, and they're all quite similar. Some are a little bit different. If I look down here at a Boolean, then I can see here news required is actually an integer. These are stored as zeros and ones, and I'll touch on that shortly. But basically, what you're doing here is you're creating a structure in SQL through Navision. Right. Now, we have quite a lot of properties that we need to take a look at and go through, and this is a fundamental part of what we're covering today. So, as I said, the critical, and I'm not covering everything, remember that we're doing this in 2 sections for more detail. So just touching on the properties that you'll be coming in contact with and should become familiar with. So if I look at my list here of the properties, and I can I can get here and I can open this in my developer, and let's start now and go through those properties. Okay, so first one, field number. You remember last week that Luc was explaining about table numbers? Field numbers are very similar. The concept is similar. There are a few differences though. Firstly, within a table, if you if the table number, as is in this case, is 50,000 to 99,000, you can use any number you want within the 1 to 99,000 range. Whether you should or not is still always a question, because you have a field here in one table in 50,000, you won't be able to use that field number in a different table in another part of the system because you don't have permission to it. So it's that you've got to come up with your own idea of how you're going to do that. And typically, we always put within the first 10 numbers we use for the primary key of the numbering system. So always keep a gap, exactly the same as you would to keep a space going forward. Okay, so straightforward. The next thing is the naming convention of the fields. Now, unfortunately, as you all know, Navision came from a different background. It wasn't on SQL, and there are a number of problems that the field in Navision in earlier versions didn't have captions. So whatever we want to display on the form is the actual field name. With captions, that's not actually necessary, because I can have, if we have a look here at the caption, I can actually have a different caption, but still we do keep certain characters in tables that we shouldn't have. Now, why is this a problem? If I look here, I have a field NO dot, which seems okay, except that when I go back to SQL and see what it's actually created on the SQL side, then I will see here that the column NO is actually being replaced by NO and underscore. So this is from when you originally create the database, and you put in here these identifiers that you want to convert. So you've probably all seen this feature. If you're not sure what that is, basically it says if I see any of these characters, then when I write that data to SQL, or the field object names to SQL, I'm going to substitute those characters instead. So the dot, double quote, backslash, forward slash, %, and square brackets. Unfortunately, the system still allows you to do things like amount, dollars, and profit %, which will actually, this is allowed, it's acceptable, it will work, it's fine, but we have to start thinking that we're not just living in a world of Navision anymore. We have developers from every walk of life that are doing every form of different development language, and they are not going to like to see things like this, amount, $sign as a variable. So even though you can try to limit using these complex characters as in fields. Okay, next property. I'm sorry, you can't see the PowerPoint. Right, so the next one we just saw, of course. Great, my properties are gone. Where are my properties? Great. Okay. Ah, there they are. Right. Next one is caption. It's a very bad habit that many developers get into, is they don't use captions. Please always put a caption in. And very importantly, I'm guessing there's a lot of people out there that are not native English speakers. Even if your English isn't very good, please stick to the rule of always making field names in English, and you add a caption in your own language. Just don't use foreign language names for fields. It just causes you a lot of problem. You've got the captions, you can go into here, add your own language, and do it while you're creating it. Don't do the habit of leaving this out, doing all your development, and then coming back later. It only takes a second to hit F8, copy that in there. With your language, make sure that you have your language set to English. If you don't, it'll copy the caption to the wrong language. So please slip that to English so that your captions are correct. Okay. I'm only covering certain ones of these properties. Now, the next one that is critical is a data type. And at the end, I'm going to go through choices of data type. There are a lot of data types. Many of them you'll never use, or you'll use them very, very rarely. Some of them you'll use all the time. So for instance, Boolean, code, date, decimal, integer, option, text, you'll use every day when you're developing in Navision. They're very regular things, but it is critical to do that. Attached to code, attached to the data type, is the data length, which applies to text and code fields. Again, I'll cover the details later, but the data length tells what is the maximum length of data that you can put into that field. Keep in mind that these are 4-byte boundaries, so things like Navision storing this as a 20 when in fact it's going to store 24, it'll store 20, but there is a rounding factor in there, so the lengths are not exact. So the next one, enabled, I just recommend not to ever use this. It just causes problem, and Microsoft have we have a new features now with obsolete, which I'm not covering right now, but basically disabling a field is just a recipe for disaster, so just don't do that. Okay, give it a second. Sorry, I'm just on this data length, field class. Field class you will use a lot. This is to do with flow fields, and flow fields we're covering in the next session, but this is a field that you will use a lot. Then editable. Now editable, very simple. It means that no matter what you do with this field, what form you put it on, what page you put it on, you won't be able to edit that from Navision. You can, of course, go in the back end through SQL, but this is used for fields where you have a table that is editable, but there might be a specific field you don't want edited. So you might have a calculation that multiplies two numbers you've entered and you don't want someone to be able to change the result, so you would put that as non-editable. Now the next one, and this is very, very hard to explain exactly what it is and why is it not blank yes and why isn't it mandatory, because this field is not mandatory. What this field not blank means is that you cannot type a blank value into that field. It doesn't mean that you can't leave the field blank. So it really only works on the primary key. On the primary key, you must enter a value to enter the data. If you put it on any other field that isn't in the primary key, there's no guarantee that it will ever mean anything, except that if there's a number in there, it won't be able to be deleted. So not a good explanation, but important to understand. Right. Next one, get down to date formula. Again, we're not going to be going into that in detail just now, but date formula is very important. And in David Studebaker's book, he's got a very good little bit of code there that we will go through the next session to show how to calculate them. And the next one that you'll use just about all the time is table relation. And this will, not in this field, but if I take, for instance, where's another one? Radio show type. It says that any value I put into this field radio show type must be available in this other table called radio show type. Under that, there are two associated fields. One is validate. This was important in early versions of Navision, but now I would not be using it. I would use code. What this allows me to do is to have a link where I can have a drill down. I can pull a value from the table, but I can choose to change it. It's used in GL account and a few account schedules and a few areas like this where you want to combine text but still have a drill down ability. It's always better to write that in code, so it probably won't be using that field. The last one, test table relationship, simply doesn't work anymore, so just ignore it. It was from the old classic client, doesn't work, doesn't do anything now, so that's fine. All right. Now, just touch on base on a couple of other values that are used, but used rarely, and that is init value. Init value, in some ways, you might consider it going with the not blank. It's simply, if you set this value, it will say that when you create a new record, it will automatically initialize this value. but it is problematic because one thing is it's specific to Navision. This doesn't happen in SQL, even though a lot of people think so. So be aware that if you put an init value in here, if you're calling web services, fine, it'll work. You're doing all that, but if you've got your SQL people on the back end doing anything, it won't be updating. So be aware of that. Values allowed. Again, there are other ways of doing this, but I can put a list in here of characters I need, and it's very good. For instance, if you type 09 and 09 AZ, and I can say I only want 0 to 9, lowercase a to z, uppercase a to z, to give you a limit to not put special characters. When we're doing implementations in countries that have complex diacritics, we use this a lot to prevent them from putting complex characters that would cause sorting issues. Okay, and next one here, SQL data type. I'll show you let me just change tables. And it is this one here. Yeah, good. The SQL data type property is quite important to understand what it does, but there are ways to get around it without using the property. Basically, when SQL sorts, it will sort in telephone book order, which means basically alphabetical. Whereas Navision in older versions sorted in a more of a numeric method, and then it put text in, which means if you had GL accounts with combined letters, or if you had GL accounts that had 2 digits and then 4 and 5, in Navision it does mess up quite a bit. So let's have a look at that. I created 2 fields. One is a code with SQL type varchar. The other one is code with the sorting type integer. And if I have a look at these fields now, you will see that if this is the code I should be using. I should have 001, 002, 02, so that everything is 3 digits long. It sorts nicely. I can add them up. They look good. I can see here, I put the same fields, but if I sort by code with the setting here, sorry, the varchar, you can see it sorts first by the 1, then it sorts by the 2. So then it's the 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 12. So it's a telephone book sorting, and that's the standard way that SQL sorts. This is an integer now, 1, 10, 100. It's still a little bit, there we go, 1, 2, 10, 11, 12, 100. So it gives you that numerical sorting. It's very good for GL accounts or where you're using numbers, but the better solution is simply in your field, sort by putting the same number of digits everywhere. Now you'll see this in sales order numbers. I'm not sure how many people are partners or how many customers. If you're a partner, you've definitely seen it. If you're a customer, you may have seen it where you thought, oh, we'll never have more than 10,000 orders in our business, so let's just use 5 digits for 4 digits, whatever, for the order number. And all of a sudden you get to order number 9999, your 10,000th one, and suddenly goes to 10,000, and boom, your sorting's gone. You try to find your last order and it's near the top, and it becomes quite a mess. And that's why the core is to understand your business, put enough digits in that field so that it does it, not to use those properties. Okay, right, done. Next. No, right, sorry, come on. No, sorry, I lost my PowerPoint. I don't know where it's gone. There we go. Right. All right, so the next thing we've got on our little list here is triggers. Now, triggers in fields are very simple. There's only 2. There is one on lookup and one on validate. And what I've done is I've simply put a little bit of code, and it's not Navision, is it? And in here, I have put some code. Very simple. All I'm doing on validate, when I type into this field, I want to look for the record that it's referencing to. It'll be using by my lookup. I want to pull the name out of that and put it into my radio show field. So now let's look this and run it, and let's see what happens. And I can go in here. Let's create a new one, RS8, and we can drill down. And it didn't. Why didn't it? Great. Nope, I messed it completely, didn't I? Okay.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to suggest.
Yeah.
That's one of the dark things, and it's something you need to tell them too.
No, that's why I put it in there. It was part of my example, but I forgot that I forgot to delete it. Oh, I did it again, didn't I? I did it again. Okay. Right. So for those that love our developer, you can open multiple instances of the object designer at times. I'm sure you'll know. So I can open one here, and I can open it here. And of course, if I make changes in both and save in both, it doesn't save them correctly. Yeah, that's a 101 mistake, rookie mistake. So there you go. Even after 26 years, you still make the rookie mistakes. Okay. So now, hopefully, we can drill. And if I grab one of these, basically my code says, yes, if I enter music, get this record, pull this data in, and populate this field. So it automatically populates the name for me. Very, very simple code. Doesn't do anything flash. The second trigger that you have, and there are only two triggers. The other one is on lookup, and that is that little arrow button. So just whatever basically, and the online help is exactly right here. It says whatever you type here, whatever code you put in here, will replace the default lookup function. So I'm putting a comment, which obviously does nothing, and I will save this. And hopefully, actually, I'll just force it because it may not have. All right, so force, and now I run this, and now there's no drill down. The reason for that is it's running my code, which is a comment, and it's doing that. Now, this happens in a lot of places in Navision, wherever you've got a trigger if the online help says this trigger will replace the default function, it means that even if you put a comment, it will do it. So if you put some code in somewhere it doesn't work and you comment it out, those comments will replace the function and do nothing. So as you can see, I can click here as much as I want and nothing will happen. So not really about fields, it's about a lot of areas, but still an important little thing. I'm not going to get too much into triggers. I just want to show you them. Triggers we will we'll cover a little bit more next time. But just be aware that the on validate is the only one you normally really use. Now, there are so many features in the RTC that replace on lookup. You can select different tables now. You can select field groups to determine which fields will pull up. So in most cases, you don't need to write code in on lookup, but of course you still do. But having said that, one of the questions we get on about this trigger is, when do you put code on this trigger and when do you put triggers on the pages? You'll be doing pages next session, and the answer is very simple. You don't put anything on a page unless you absolutely have to, and anything you put on a page should only be for presentation of the data, not how it looks. So basically, if you're entering a field into Navision, the user is typing data into Navision, and it's a field, then the validation, the code should happen on that field, nowhere else. The field owns that data. The properties should be there. It should be attached. Now, of course, we're not covering events here, and I guess there's going to be a new generation of people that won't even use the onValidate. But the same principle occurs. So you should be putting the trigger, whether you're putting it here or onto an extended event, put it on the field, not on the page. Okay. Triggers. Right. Okay, so now I want to go through and find this. And I want to go through and discuss a number of choices. The core of I can jump back, can't I? Why not? In the beginning, I asked what is an ERP system, and an ERP system is a lot of things. But fundamentally, and especially the direction that Navision is moving now, is that we're going to see more and more where the functionality of Navision becomes less and less important. These processes, the data, the reports are all going to become less and less important. And what is going to be more important is the common data model. That is how the data is stored in Navision. That means how that data is going to be accessed by other systems. If I'm going to, yes, I'm going to use web services through my Android phone to connect into the data and to check my orders. But there's going to be other ways of using that data that we never even thought of. There are going to be other reporting tools, not just Power BI. There are going to be lots of different ways to access it. So it's very important to make good choices when your database design. If you design your tables correctly, you design the fields, you design the links, people are going to be able to connect into your system. They're going to be able to write events that work on your tables. But if you design complex table structures and complex fields linked together, that's not going to be a possibility. So it becomes more and more important nowadays than it ever was before, because back in my day, it was a box called Navision and no one else touched it. So I could do whatever I wanted. You can't really do that. So what I want to just do is because next week we're on the next session on fields, we're going to go into a lot of details about how we actually can utilize the data and what we can do with it. And I'd just like to go through and basically preempting questions in reality of preempting questions that you should be asking yourself when you're designing your table. I'm not going to go into tables, but when you design each particular table, what you should do. So the first one, code versus text. So I can go into my system and, okay, code is uppercase, and if I look at here, they're uppercase and lowercase. But other than that, what is the difference between a code field and a text field? The code field uses 1 extra byte for alignment, which is a very strange thing because it's not used anymore, but it still uses the space. So a code actually uses, even though it can only use half the number of characters of a text field, it actually uses more space. And of course, especially with Unicode, then that gets bigger and bigger. So it's an issue to concern yourself with. But fundamentally, the difference between a code field and a text field in a typical Navision database is that a code is something that is rigid and defined. We have a way of how it should be and what it should mean. If I've got this particular radio show type, then if I go in here, very simply, I can see I've got a, don't like this, I've got a structure to this, it's got a code, and the text is the description. So codes generally, it's very obvious when you need a code. There are some that aren't obvious, like for instance, telephone number. In the early days, we used to be told to use telephone numbers for codes. Bad idea. A code is something that doesn't really change much. It's very stable, it sorts well, it's organized. The description is your name. So generally, it is pretty obvious as you go along, and you'll find it, and you shouldn't be stuck not knowing where to put it. One of the things about a code field is if you're using a foreign language and you do have complex diacritics, you should not be putting diacritics in code fields. They will cause severe performance issues when you're searching in SQL. If you're filtering, it becomes complex, and we'll cover more of that in the next session. But keep them using the numbers 0 to 9 and the letters, capital letters A to Z, and just stop at that. If you need more than that, really think about how you're designing your database. So those are those two. And thing. Now, next one. Integer versus Boolean versus option. Now, you'll get cases where you're not really sure. A Boolean is generally pretty obvious. It's yes and no. Important to know is that an integer, a Boolean, and an option, they use exactly the same integer in SQL. They have the same keys and indexes on them. They have the same performance, the same amount of data. There's no real difference. From the outside world, there's no real difference. There's no particular choice. It's just how it looks to you on the screen. So when then is the difference between a Boolean? Obviously, there's two, but sometimes I've seen options where people have put yes, no, because they wanted yes and no on the screen instead of a tick box. You could have done that easily in an older version of Navision. Currently, it's a little more complex, but the Boolean generally becomes pretty obvious. Integer, we just don't use in Navision. You've got to be aware that if you write an option string, so let me go back to my Navision and look at one of my options. If I have here, not that one. I have a frequency, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. These values are stored as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 in SQL. So I'm storing them as integers. So if someone is writing code to use my database outside of Navision, they're going to have some sort of metadata. They're going to have some mapping to know what those numbers mean. So there's still no problem using an option field. The option field is nice because all your RTC is designed around it. Your reports will print this. It will look nice. And what's really lovely is you can go to properties, and I can put here a caption, and I can do this, which is even better. I can copy this, and then I can go here, and I can put my captions in whatever language I want. So it's really nice to use an option if you can use an option. They work well. Okay, next one. Now, so then you got an option, and this is the bigger question, probably the biggest one, especially beginner developers ask in Navision, is should I use a code versus an option? It's actually very, very simple to determine which you should use, but people do still tend to get lost. This is a list where, not a good example. Let me get the better one, sorry. No, don't say that. Here I have an option. In fact, this is perfect. So here I have an option of type. This is basically in my playlist for my radio show. I can use resources, a show, or an item. A resource might be a person that's going to sing live or a live presenter. A show would be an actual show, might be a pre-recorded show I put on, and an item could be an advert. I mean, they could be whatever I want, but a resource, a show, and item are three completely different things. If I write code, knowing that it's resource, show, or item will not help me at all. I have to write different code to handle each of those processes. They're completely unrelated. So in your typical .NET world, this would be like a case statement. I want to run a case, and if it's going to be a resource, then I want to run this code. If it's a show, I want to run this code. If it's an item, I want to run this code. Three completely separate ways of working things. So there's no value in having a code there. A code belongs more with radio type, because with radio type, I can add more in here, and I have music, news, talk, and I might have, I've got chat, chat, whatever, it's probably there. I can add a chat show. Now, any properties that I have about a call-in or a music or a news or a talk, there'll be an hourly rate, there'll be prices. So the code would be identical. I would simply have parameters that link to this field, and my code would be the same. I wouldn't need a case statement. I would simply have code that goes through. It says find the rates for talk, multiply it by the number of minutes, and move forward. It's done. So it's a pretty straightforward, I hope to see the difference between why you'd use an option versus a code. This one here, I think, was a harder choice because vinyl, CD, MP3 are all should be a code. PSA advertisement are something completely different, so that possibly should be an option. So I'd rethink the design and say, have I actually worked my design out right? If you get to a point here where you think, well, this is a medium, vinyl is a medium, CD is a medium, MP3 is a medium, but advertisement it's a product. It actually is an item. So these don't fit. So in fact here, if you get stuck in, you don't know if it should be an item or a code, it probably means your database design is wrong. So there we go. Oh, sorry, sorry, Luke, did you want me to answer these questions? I just saw this one. Or do we do it at the end? We can do it at the end?
I had already answered the question, and then I will get back to that later.
Good, fabulous, fabulous. Okay. Now the next, oh, go back. The next important thing is integer versus decimal. This is an interesting question that people do struggle with. And in fact, I had a client with about 4 or 5 terabyte database that decided integer was the way to go, and they put all their record, put a whole lot of modifications where they had a field called resource and they set it to integer, and suddenly realized that they needed it as decimal, and that was a big job to move it over. So the items, for example, always used to get the issue, why are items integer, decimal, not integer? Because items can be kilograms that you're selling in grams, and they can be decimals. The thing you need to allow for is that you can never go from an integer to decimal, but you can always go from a decimal to an integer. So if you're, for instance, counting age and you say, I want to know a person's age, it's going to be 10 years, 11 years, 12 years. Well, you never know if you might want to do it as decimals as well. If you don't do it as decimal, you can never go back. Anything where you're doing any math on it, if you're multiplying it, counting it out, you should be using as floats and not as integers, right? Pushing on time. How are we going, Luke? How are we going for time? How much more? I've got 10 minutes. Am I good? We don't have a lot of questions, so yeah. Let me just finish these 2, then we'll see if there's questions, and if there isn't, I'll finish these other ones, because otherwise these are actually, the other 2 columns are for next session. So you have the next thing is duration versus integer versus big integer. Now, I'm throwing these out here, and I know I haven't covered them yet. They're going to be covered next week, but I want to have this understanding of the choices we need to make so that the next session in 2 months' time, we can get straight into the work. So the duration versus integer versus big integer, pretty straightforward because they're all stored in Navision as integers. Integer versus big versus tiny is simply how big the number needs to be. So it really doesn't come down to that. But more important are the date calculations that we'll be covering again next time, and date versus date time versus time. Now the date, this one is pretty straightforward, that you don't use time a lot in Navision. In fact, since date time makes more sense, I find it very rare to use time. If ever you use a time field in Navision, you're almost certainly going to come across where it crosses midnight and suddenly it's all a mess. So I generally avoid time where possible. But date versus date time, generally pretty straightforward for me, is that any event that specifically happens on a particular date, like accounting, it doesn't matter what time zone you're in. It doesn't matter if you're doing accounts for someone else in another country on the other side of the world through your Citrix session. The point is that accounting is always done by date. It doesn't matter whether you did the accounting at 10 p.m. in Europe for an American company or vice versa, it really doesn't matter. It's the actual date that matters. So since Navision is fundamentally an accounting system, most of the transactions would use date. Where date time comes is very simple, is where you've got transactions that pass over midnight, and especially manufacturing times, long durations, tasks that you need to know what will happen in those. Within date, another issue is that we have closing dates. Again, these are the special things that we'll cover in the next session. And closing dates only work for dates, not for date time. Okay, so what I do, because the rest of this stuff is the triggering for our next session. But Luke, if there are any questions, go through it. Otherwise, I'll move forward.
There was a short question that I answered already. Is does a Boolean data type have a default value? Mm-hmm. And that's false. Maybe you might elaborate a little bit on what is the default value of, let's say, data type in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, let me just grab back to Navision. So each field has its own default. So in most cases, it will be null. Sorry, it will be blank. Definitely not null. It will be blank. So document number in here will be blank. But here, we would always, in a case like this, we would say not blank, yes. So it would have to have a value. And we do this to prevent someone from accidentally creating a blank record. That's simply for historical purposes, that in old versions of Navision, when you deleted a primary record, it renamed all the primary key to blank. And if you already had a blank record, you couldn't rename and you couldn't search. That doesn't work anymore because you can't search on replace on a blank, so not really relevant anymore. So yeah, code is a blank. Most variables reset to what you think. They'll go to 0 or they'll go to blank. This is why in an option string, we normally always keep a blank. I don't know if you can see that in there is a blank at the very beginning, which is basically the same as writing 2 double quotes or with a space. So this is option 0. Even if we're not allowing option 0, we would still keep the comma there so that our option strings are blank. And Boolean, as I said, Boolean, option, and integer are all the same in SQL. So if I can just add yes, no in here, and Boolean, and just force this playlist, doesn't matter. If I now go to
Well, as you just said, David, before, of course, SQL will not obey to the rules, so that's what you're showing right now. Eh? Actually, you better open the table enough to see what the default value is.
Yeah, you're right. It's going to be too much work here. Yeah, you're right. It's going to take me too long I picked the wrong table. I had a table down here that I'd prepared for that, and I should have used that. Right, so if this is 0, 1, 2, I put this on 2, and I'll put my Boolean as a yes, and my, this can be 1 minute, minute. And now I can go back here. then I can see my yes, no is 1. My duration is converted to 60,000 milliseconds. My type is 2 as an integer. But the defaults, if I now create another record, and we'll just call this the same. And these are all defaults. Then we can see now time is the first day in SQL, which is 1753. Zeros, 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 and blanks. So pretty simple and straightforward. Okay. All right. So, sorry, what's the question? Can you read that question out to me? So, there's another question.
It was a complex one on code. We leave that for now. I simply gave an answer.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm basically finished. The rest of it was if we had more time, and that is for the next session. Do we have any questions, or do we want to?
If you want to do Q&A, we're getting to the end almost. If you say that's fine. If anybody has questions, come around with your questions. So there were, just wanted to say thank you for a great session, Michel said. So that's a compliment to you, Dave.
Thank you. Okay, so if there are no questions, I'll just do one more thing, which was sort of off topic that I just wanted to mention. Yeah,
feel free to do so.
And that is, okay. So one of the things that's very important about tables and fields in Navision is one of the options is data per company, and it's actually a table property, not a field property, but it is quite important. You've seen the data per company, and it's important to understand what that does. And if I look at data per company no, then Navision creates a completely different structure where all the fields, so right now, if I created these tables, right? I have a normal company table. So it's just a code and a description. And if I have a look at this, I run this, then it's just a normal table with nothing special. And if I look at it in SQL, then it is, oh no, I did it again. And here I can see my data. Every time I create a company, it's going to add the company name with a $sign in front of that table. So every field that I've created is now duplicated. Every field here exists in this table. It exists every time I create a new company. All those tables, all those fields are replicated. Every index on every field is replicated in another table. On the other hand, this other one I've got here where I have set the property I've set the property to data per company no. That is actually stored in a completely separate table right at the bottom. Well, it's even worse, but let's just say right at the bottom, and all by itself without any company pretext. So this table is much simpler. Now, I didn't want to do that because it wasn't mentioned in the table. It's not mentioned in the book, and I just wanted to emphasize that because it'll be relevant to our next session we're doing. So there's very important that field. Yep.
There's one question, Dave, to close from Henrik Jensen. You more or less already gave some hints, but maybe just as a roundup for today, how do you decide what data type to use when designing? He asks, do you have some guidelines? You more or less compared some things like code versus text. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, it is. I think this is one of the things that I feel very strongly right now, and we had in the Navision world, we have a very strict set of rules. There is a design guideline. There's a book that shows you everything you should use. It shows you the naming conventions. But the types of the fields, the only book you're ever going to find documented is probably in Mark's design patterns book, because it's done by copying what we did before and building on patterns. But that is going to be a problem in the future, because we're trying to say that Navision is moving out of its own little bubble and becoming a more worldly product, which means we need to also start thinking more of SQL and how SQL developers would do it, because the sort of developers we're getting now are not going to be content with simple CAL. And now, yeah, sure, we've got the new AL developer, but nothing's changed. It's just a pretty facade on the old code. So I think it's a big question, and I think when we look at flow fields and should we use flow field, where should we use flow fields, where we shouldn't, things like nulls and timestamps and how those are used, it does become quite complex. Special characters, should we have dots and spaces in the field names? Should we be using tiny int, big int, large integer? You know, how should we be naming it? It's a longer topic. It's something that I think needs a lot more discussion, especially with this new world. So yeah, I've only touched on it now, but there's a lot more to that.
Okay, I think we're going to round up. Thank you very much, David. Thank you for your enthusiasm. Thank you for joining in to the audience. As a last one to mention, next week on the 3rd of April, we will have a webinar on with the title Dynamics 365 from the Trenches. It will be just the day before that Microsoft is going to release Dynamics 365 Business Central, the now really ready online version. And Dimitri and Alexander, two of them have been already putting their hands on it and want to share their first experience with that with you on the 3rd of April. So if you want to join in, the newsletter will be going out with links for you to register, so feel free to do so. Once again, thank you to you, David, and Joe. Thank you very much for supporting us on this again today. And to you all, have a nice day, and join us in one of our next sessions. Bye for now.
Thanks, Luke.